curious about how the Indian state really works, its levers of power, tech ambitions, and geopolitical maneuvers, explore it all through one of three specializations in our 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Applications close August 24th.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. My name is Malathi Renati, and I head the policy school at the Takshashila Institution. And today, the topic that we'll be looking at is how we can replace animal testing with human-based research. There's been a global policy shift towards it, and how can India lead, from the front? Our guest for today's episode is working in precisely this area. She's Surat Parvatam. She's a senior strategist from the Humane World for Animals. She's part of the research and toxicology department. Now, the Humane World for Animals was formerly called the Humane Society International. They're based out of the US, and they've been leaders in animal protection movements. So Surat Parvatam has done her PhD in cell biology from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai. She managed the Center for Predictive Human Model Systems, a policy center and think tank at the Atal Incubation Center. And this center works to enable human-relevant technologies in India by engaging with different stakeholders. So welcome to the episode, Surat.
Thank you, Malathi, for the generous introduction, and happy to be a part of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So what we'll do in this episode is we'll study the topic from a Samaj Sarkar and Bazaar perspective. So Surat is a domain expert in this topic. So we shall first try to understand what is animal testing, then look at the policies in India and globally. And then we'll just then take a look at the markets and what it could do for looking at alternatives, and finally touch upon the society's role. Right. So first things first, Surat, if you can just tell our listeners, right, or just explain what is animal testing and how it came about.
Right. So animal testing, the way that you look at it for any kind of product that we use, right? We use medicines, we use chemicals like household chemicals like Dettol. All of us are familiar with pesticides. We take vaccines. So all of these, anything that humans consume, so that goes through some kind of a safety testing to assess whether it is safe for humans or not. And right now, predominantly, it is based on animals. For example, if it is a pesticide, it is first tested on animals to see can it cause irritation to skin or eye if it comes to that exposure. Can it cause cancer, carcinogenic? Can it cause developmental toxicity? So all of these different categories of products are first tested on animals to kind of predict how humans would respond to that. So that is the whole spectra of animal testing. And then there is also a sector in biomedical research where a lot of animal testing is done. So, yeah.
Okay. And what are the types of animal testing currently?
Right. So depends on which category of molecule that you look at. For example, if you are developing a drug, for example, you need to submit a series of tests to the drug regulators to make sure whether if you take that medicine for a short term, for example, can it be toxic if you take the same medicine for longer term, like for 6 months or more. So can it cause toxicity? Can it cause cancer? Can it cause again, some kind of a cardiovascular risk? So you have to assess all of these parameters when it comes to drugs. For vaccines, and it would be, again, is it effective? Is the efficacy same across different batches? Again, is it safe? And for agrochemicals, it would mainly be, if it comes in exposure to, human skin or eye, so what kind of risk it can pose. So these are the different types of tests depending on what is the type of exposure, because some would be just come in contact with skin or, outer surface, but some we would be consuming it. So in that case, you would have to assess, how our system would respond to that category of molecule. So it really depends on what class of molecule it and how humans are coming into exposure to that category of molecule. Yeah.
Right. And I do understand that the different animals, the common species include the rodents like the mice and
Right.
rats. Of course, there are rabbits, dogs,
Right.
monkeys, but we also have fish and birds that are used, right? And I
Yeah.
understand
Yeah.
even invertebrates like fruit flies based on the
Correct.
purpose of research. So why this diversity of animals?
Yeah, so mostly for the biomedical research sector, a lot of these invertebrate animals like fruit flies and they are used like fish. But for regulatory purposes, like by regulatory, I mean when you have to submit it to a drug regulator to for your molecule to get accepted as a new drug, for example, then they are very strict. This thing that you have to use one rodent and one non-rodent model, for example. So rodent would be rat or mice, and non-rodent would be rabbit, dogs, non-human primates. So for that, you cannot use like invertebrate models. So invertebrate models like fish or fly, so those are mostly used in the biomedical research space. Again, because there is some degree of genetic overlap in the sense that some genes that there are similar versions of genes which are present in, for example, fruit flies, and it's easier to kind of genetically manipulate them. So for those reasons, it is used in biomedical research space mainly, those category of species.
Yeah, but I do understand that we continue to use it, though it has increasingly emerged that drugs respond very differently in animals
Right,
and often fail when this is translated to humans, right? And yet
right,
we
right,
continue to use that. I know, of course, there is that shift,
right,
at least the intention, but
right.
why is that so? Though we know that it sort of fails, right, in humans.
Correct, correct. I mean, there are again several reasons behind. One of the main reasons was regulation wise. Like I said, like for example, the drug regulation required, like till few years back, for you to submit data which is based on animals. They required you to submit like all of these tests on whether it is toxic or not in one rodent and one non-rodent species. You could not submit data which was based on non-animal methods. But now, recently, with all of the global regulatory shift which is happening and the growing cognizance that these models may not be very predictive of human response, there have been regulatory changes as well, where both in US, Europe, and even in India, where now amendments have come into place which clearly state that you can submit non-animal models also along with the animal data to understand whether to provide the data that your drug is effective and safe to be used in humans. So that regulatory challenge is lower in some cases now in the last few years, but now the implementation challenges have come in. Although that you have that regulatory access saying that if I do submit to a regulator, it would be acceptable, but at the same time now we need to build that capacity in both the users and the regulators to kind of accept that
Right.
data.
Yeah, and I'd like to hear more about that once we get to the market, the bazaar
Sure,
side, right? So
sure.
let's now look at what the more about the policies around it, right? If can you
Right.
can you give me a chronological description of how things have panned out since independence in this area in terms of the animal legislative laws that have come into effect? And I know more recently we're seeing a lot of
Right,
new amendments being made,
right,
but could you please just describe that maybe just for
right,
our
right.
listeners as well?
Right. So, I mean, it kind of one of the landmark move was when the cosmetic testing in animals was banned in 2014, and it was not just testing in animals in India, but even import of any cosmetics that were tested in animals that was also banned. So that was landmark move that came. And then there was also in other categories, so for each category of molecules, like whether it is cosmetics, it's agrochemicals, drugs, vaccines, each of it is governed under a different set of laws, regulations, and policies. So in different categories advancements have come about, I would say. So for example, in cosmetics, that happened in 2017. There were some modifications to the what kind of tests that you need to do to test agrochemicals, for example. And
Right.
even in those guidelines, so they included the use of non-animal methods and said that wherever there are approved methods which are there, you can use them. um, and the latest, and then there were subsequent amendments to those guidelines in 2022 also. And the 2023 was a landmark amendment to new drugs and clinical trial rules, which allowed for drug testing and safety. They said that you can use non-animal methods like cell-based methods, computational tools that you can submit along with animal data for testing drug safety and efficacy. And last year there was also one move which came out in the space of vaccines, which was basically veterinary vaccines. You do a test to see whether it is safe or not, or can it cause like any abnormal effects. So what usually the test that is done is basically you just inject the vaccine into an animal to see whether the animal dies or does it show any abnormal effects. So it has been proposed for many years that this test is very non-specific. Like, for example, even if the animal dies, you really don't know what caused that death. It could be impurity, it could be anything. So we have like many more specific tests to understand what is the, if there is some impurity or any issue with the vaccine. So this was called the target animal batch safety test. So that was also removed last year from the Indian Pharmacopoeia. So Indian Pharmacopoeia gives out monographs for specific tests that need to be done for vaccine testing. So these are some of the recent events in India that have happened. Globally, there have been, again, several movements that have been happening in this space. So
Right.
the latest one being, for example, there was an announcement by FDA and NIH just few weeks back where they stated that NIH is no longer going to support research proposals that are based only on animals, which is a huge statement. They said that you have to include a non-animal component data for getting any, getting your research funded. So that was a very big statement by the US government. And they've also done a series of initiatives in the last few years. In fact, like this year itself, they released a roadmap to how they could phase out the animal studies in a stepwise manner. And the FDA Modernization Act, which was similar to the amendment to new drugs and clinical trial rules, which came out before in 2022, which also allows the use of these new technologies. And it's not just in US, like even in Europe, several such regulations have been passed to promote the use of these methodologies.
Right. And just for our listeners, so the US FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration, is a regulatory body, and its equivalent in India is known as the CSDSCO, quite a mouthful. It's nothing but the Central Drugs Standard Control Organization. So that's the equivalent in India. So I do understand that some of these policies that are put into place, and from what you've told me and from our discussions a little earlier as well, is that there's a lot of complexity, right? So even the laws that are in place and the policies are all, there's so many, and there's different ones for that come under different categories. So even to harmonize that and to make it simpler to implement, I can see that there'll be a challenge there, right? So because updating one would mean you need to update several other, but if you don't do it properly, then there's the interpretation could be quite different, right? So though India's the milestones that you mentioned as well, and there's one more that I wanted to add with respect to the ban on animal use in education, which is back in 2011, 2013. So basically they banned the dissection and experimentation on live animals in all education centers, right? So the directives then also were in place that needs to be replaced by computer simulation and non-animal alternatives. This is back in 2011, but still, till now, I guess we don't see much progress being made. So, though we do have progressive policies in place with a strong sort of legal emphasis on ethics, the minimizing animal use and advancing non-animal research methods, what's the ground reality with respect to implementation? Or what are the challenges that you see?
Right. So definitely this space, I would say, has exponentially increased in the last few years. For example, when I started working in this space in 2019, there were around 15 to 20 academic labs that were working in this space and smaller companies. And now there are more than 80 companies and labs that have started working in this space. So it is still new, but definitely, growing exponentially in India. And this is also in response to the global regulatory paradigm change that is happening. But a lot still needs to be done because there are many factors, because they are slightly more complex. So you need to kind of have that capacity to have training in kind of using these systems, how to, for example, some of these systems are like three-dimensional cell culture systems. So you should know how to have like the cell culture expertise to kind of work with these cells. And a lot of these also use like human stem cells or human primary cells. So access to those kind of cells, that raw material in terms of cell sources, that is also currently a challenge in India. And overall, like while outside the cost of these systems is cheaper actually compared to animal models, but in India, the right now cost is also a factor which comes into play, because the entire global chain, like for example, if you need to build an organoid or an organ-on-chip system, which are some of these alternate models, like all the components of it we get from outside India, like the reagent that goes into it, like the all the electronic systems that would go into it. So everything we kind of get from outside India. So none of it is being made or manufactured in India, which increases the cost of using these systems. And because
Right.
India being like a price sensitive market, so we need to kind of make sure that how can we, work towards bringing the cost of these systems in India to make like adopt like a broader use. And another aspect is, which is also like a lot of these labs and companies are building these systems, and each one often use their own protocols and SOPs to kind of make those systems, which makes it difficult for the regulators to assess how to kind of evaluate these systems. For animal models, they have been in use for so many decades, so okay, if this shows like XYZ, this is how you
Right.
evaluate them. Because these are new systems, the parameters for standardization and evaluation is also evolving. So there needs to be like global harmonization for that also, where you come with a set of guidelines. Okay, if the organoids show like XYZ parameters, that's how you can know that they are working for your system and
Right.
things like that. So
But couldn't India, like, which are the countries right now which are more advanced in this area,
right,
right? Like the moving out of
right.
animal testing. Couldn't India then collaborate with those international partners and kind of access that the cutting edge tools and training?
Yeah, so I would say US and Europe are some of the pioneers in this
Mm.
space. Like US, one of the companies in US called Emulate, which is actually a spin-off from an institute called Wise Institute, which is based in Harvard, which developed these organ on chip systems. So they have now submitted a system called Liver on Chip, which is
Mhm.
basically used to assess liver toxicity. Like if you have any drug, to see whether it can cause toxicity to your liver. So you can
Mhm.
use that system to kind of test that. So they have submitted to the regulators, and it's already a part of the process where it is assessed by the regulators. And if it qualifies for the system, it can officially be used as a part of the regulatory system. So that is like one of the closest system that is close to regulatory acceptance.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, definitely I think we could collaborate, but then there's also the issue of IP and all of those things that we would
Mm.
have to kind of deal around it. Like some of the things that we've also been discussing with these global players, like if they could bring their systems to India, and then then Indian companies or academic labs could use them. But again, the cost component comes in, because
Right.
even if they come to India, the cost would still be like quite high. So
So
yeah.
possibly exploring integrating animal-free testing methods into existing missions, like Make in India,
Right,
should be
exactly.
something
Yeah,
the
yeah.
government should
So
be
that is
looking at.
definitely like we need to do, because right now the entire supply chain for making these systems is dependent globally. So we need to make these systems like cost effective and accessible to a broader population. We need to kind of have like the entire supply chain based in India,
Right.
which would be again via all of the uh, resources that you mentioned, like Make in India or Ayushman Bharat. So where you can get the entire supply chain made in India, right from like we
Mm.
need to set up biobanks, we need to have like homegrown cell repositories and all the reagents, etc. So if we can do that, we can significantly bring down the cost of these systems.
Right. And the when you look at generally, right, India's pharmaceutical and biotech industry is quite robust, right? It was
Right,
valued at around 65 billion last year in 2024.
right,
It's estimated to expand to up to 130 um, US
right,
billion dollars and by 2030, right? So
right.
um, when you're looking at this, can we leverage this transition to build that competitive edge globally? Because then India can then be a leading market if you have the complete supply chain within
Right,
India, and then
right.
in turn India starts supplying it to other countries, right?
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, that's a great point. The only issue with that is that in the India pharma sector, it's mainly generics and biosimilars driven. Like the pharma companies that are currently in India, there is quite less companies that are involved in making new drugs, for example.
Right.
Most of them are involved in making generics and biosimilars, which are basically compounds which have been already developed globally. And once the patent for those compounds expire, you
Hmm.
basically make like homegrown versions of them. So those are called generics. So that is the major market in India. Um, but having said that, there are a few companies that do have drug discovery pipeline which are making like newer compounds, and also
Hmm.
for these newer products like cell and gene therapy products which have been coming up in India in the last few years. So even for the testing of those products also, these systems could be used. So there is definitely a market, and we have to kind of look at it in a futuristic ways, because even if we have that market in the next 10 or 15 years, we need to start investing in these systems like now if we need to build them in the next decade.
Absolutely, yes. Could you just list out, and you have mentioned this, over the last few minutes, right? But can you just list out the alternatives to animal testing, right? I know there's 3D printing, there is bioprinting, and there are quite a few. But could you just list out, maybe give a brief description for our listeners as well, what it means?
Sure. So now there are several new like systems which are based on human cells. So
Mm-hmm.
some of these are called organoids. So
Right.
organoids are basically organ-like structures which are
Mm.
very miniature. They will be like few millimeter sized
Is
structures.
this on the chip, the one that's often
So
on?
that is an organ on chip. So these are organoids. So this is a different system. So
Okay.
organoids is like basically organ-like structures. So you will
Right.
have like mini or like liver organoid, liver like brain organoid, lung organoid.
Is it through 3D printing that?
Not really through 3D printing. So basically, what it's based on, it's called where you get like it can be based on stem cells, where
Mm-hmm.
if you have stem cells which are basically induced pluripotent stem cells, which are basically ordinary cells which are taken and they can be reprogrammed into stem cells. So they are called like induced stem cells. So they,
Okay.
and if you give like certain reagents and factors to those induced stem cells, they can
Mm-hmm.
basically reorganize into like brain, small like miniature versions of brain, liver, depending on what kind of reagents and growth factors you give them. So then you can kind of, they self organize into these smaller structures.
Okay.
So those are one form where which people do, like you have like mini livers, mini brain, those kind of structures. So that is one type. And then
Mm.
you have organ on chip, which are basically like these microfluidic channels. They'll be like a double A battery size structures, which
Right.
are microfluidic channels, which are those inside those channels, which will be lined with human cells. So if it's a liver on
Mm.
chip, it'll be lined with human liver cells. And then you have like a flow passing through it to simulate blood flow, and then you
Okay.
can pass your drugs or whatever molecule that you want to test. So
Mm.
these systems, they don't exactly replicate a human organ or this thing, but they aim to replicate some of the critical functionalities or
Mhm.
structural elements of that, whatever minimal features are required to understand what would be the effect of whether a pathogen or a drug. So
Mm.
it's a minimalistic system, I would say. And then another thing is also like actual human data wherever it's available, like real world data, as we say. So like because lot of like there are a lot of hospitals and there are a lot of actual human data which is already available. So we also
Right.
need to kind of collate all of that and use that for research or drug development also.
This is outside of clinical trials, right?
Yeah, clinical trials or human clinical data from biopsies and a lot of human data which is already out there. So
Right.
we also need to harness the power of existing human data which is out there and kind of compile that and use that in our analysis. And then yeah,
Okay.
computational tools. So and AI is coming up in this space also. So
Right. AI
recently
is
US
something.
FDA also released a guidelines on how like regulations for using AI for drug regulatory submissions, so how you could use that, what kind of endpoints that you could test it for. So
Hmm.
you can use computational models to kind of predict how, once you take a drug or a medicine, for example, how does it get absorbed, transported, or excreted from a human system, for example. You can create computational models to kind of predict that, because again, animals kind of absorb drugs very differently than how we do. And
Right.
they might absorb it less or more. So if we improperly predict that, so we may take like wrong dosage of a drug. So they are using like human parameters to kind of predict how a human system would respond to a drug.
Right.
So these are all some of the systems here.
Right, because I mean, it makes sense to do this
Yeah.
because we have the data that 90% of drugs that pass animal testing
Right.
fail in human clinical trials.
Right. Right.
90%, and
Yeah.
yet we are kind of subjecting animals of
Right.
different
Right.
breeds through all of this, which is
Right.
ethically also not correct.
Right. Right.
So, could there be incentives such as regulatory fast tracking or tax breaks, maybe for companies using these sort of human relevant tools to encourage more private sector innovation in India? Do you see that possibility of that happening?
Yeah, that's definitely like that's also something that we would want. Like we're working with the government to see what kind of incentives we can give. Like
Yeah.
there have been some incentives or initiatives that have been released by government also, like which kind of incentivizes innovation in the private sector. So some of these
Right.
schemes can be, but if we can have like focused scheme for this particular area, like a funding scheme where you kind of promote the use of development of these systems. Like for
Mm-hmm.
example, US also they recently released a scheme called Complementary, where under
Mm.
this scheme it's a $400 million program. Where under this scheme they are kind of have different verticals where how do you build these systems, how do you validate them, how do you standardize them, how do you have build like capacity for these systems. So they have like a very structured funding program for the entire like this space. So we need
Right.
to have like a structured funding space for, because for building these systems, even to qualify or make these systems, you need dedicated funding. So
Yeah.
like a dedicated scheme with a very structured thing in 3 5 years, how can we have like 4 or 5 technologies with in collaboration with industry, so that we have that because they'll be one of the end users. So
Mm.
with hospitals, because they could be providing human cells, so hospitals, pharma sector, and also patient groups. So because recently there was this meeting on rare diseases.
Mm.
So rare disease also, like India has one of the largest populations of rare diseases, and there are often like no animal models for most of the rare diseases.
Mm-hmm.
And globally also a lot of this testing for rare disease is being done using these systems. Like a few years back, Sanofi submitted data to the drug regulator in US FDA, basically using where they showed that a particular molecule was effective for a certain rare disease using purely non-animal based data, like organ on chip data. So there is a lot of potential for these sectors also. And so yeah, so patient groups where so it needs to be a multi-stakeholder collaboration where we build a program like that. Yeah,
Also, because when if it's a rare disease in India, you're looking at the genetic, you're looking at
exactly,
the local populace, right?
exactly. Yeah,
So, I mean,
yeah,
using international data wouldn't really help, right?
exactly,
Because the
exactly.
ethnicity and everything comes
Yeah,
in.
yeah.
Okay.
And also like most of the, like it was also raised during this thing, like most of the clinical trials which happen globally, most of
Mm.
them they don't include like Indian populations.
Right.
So we need to have like more patient specific systems where we can test. For example, if we have like Indian patient derived iPSCs lines,
Mm-hmm.
which are basically those induced pluripotent stem cells, which are based on Indian patients, for example. We can have like
Right.
a more specific understanding of how Indian populations would respond to a drug.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah,
Right. So there's a lot in the markets that the markets could do, right? Like investing in
right,
human relevant testing
right, right,
technologies. You mentioned about the
right,
biotech startup innovation, right? That could
right, right,
also harnessing artificial intelligence and computational tools. I think that's something that
right,
India can really leverage on, being a tech
right,
hub in
right,
many ways. And
right,
of course, strategic funding, building capacity,
right.
and even PPP, like having public-private partnerships, right? Or
Yeah,
these sectors collaborating and having
definitely,
markets being
definitely.
incentivized. These are all
Yeah.
things that right and could
Yeah.
could help the
In
market.
terms of like the role of like the companies and labs, I also want to kind of highlight. So most of these innovative technologies globally actually came out of academic labs and smaller companies. They were not developed by big pharma, because for
Right.
big pharma to kind of get into something very new which has a no low technology readiness level, it is like too risky for them. So one of
Mm-hmm.
the two major players in this field right now, which is Emulate and Insvero. So Emulate is based in US and Insvero is based in Europe. So they build like organoids and organ on chip systems. So both of them came out of academic lab. Like Emulate, for example, was a spin-off from Wise Institute, which is based in Harvard, which initially
Right.
developed this technology and became like a spin-off of that. And
Mm-hmm.
Insvero actually licensed this technology from ETH Zurich, which is a public university in Zurich. So this highlights the role of what academic labs and smaller companies in India could also do that. Like we don't have to wait for big pharma to kind of develop these tools. Like labs and companies, like even smaller companies, have a very important role to play, where they could bring these technologies from lower technology readiness level, like 1 2 3, to relatively higher technology readiness levels, and then that could be transferred to bigger pharma companies or other end users. So
Absolutely, yes. I think we need to be creative and innovative, right, in how we approach
yeah,
it.
right,
I think
right.
that's crucial. So just moving on to the last bit, how aware is the Indian public about this, especially students and researchers, about alternatives to animal testing? How do you suggest that shift can be made, right, in science education, research training, that shift from animal testing to human-based research?
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, like India is still like relatively new to this, but in the last
Mm,
few years, we have definitely seen this shift where greater awareness and capacity building is happening. Like few years back, there were almost like no training forums for this, but now there are like four or five major organizations that do conduct like yearly training. So definitely that
mm,
shift is happening, but there also needs to be like a change in the mindset, right? Like for someone who has been using a system for decades, for them
mm,
to kind of shift to a newer system, it is also like there's also like a change in status quo, so that sensitization also needs to be brought about. And it's not, and so many of like the stakeholders often dismiss it as an ethical
mm.
aspect, right? Of course ethical aspect is important, where we need to be cognizant of how we can, because we're using the animals for our like the end use, so that is of
Right.
course there. But along with that, there's also the fact that ethical science is also good science, because when you're not treating the animals properly, or you're basically then because all these biological parameters of how animal lives, feeds, or what kind of nutrition it gets, so all of that also reflects in that information that we get from them. For example, if an
Yeah.
animal is not housed properly, or is not given proper nutrition, or not handled carefully, the stress
Right.
level, so that also reflect in what biology we infer from it. So like for example, like you need for like I know one of the elements of like the recent discussion is that most of the like the animal biology research which is happens, it is not reproducible. So that is
Mm.
also another a lot of debate which has been happening, that there's so much research happening globally, but then how much of it is actually reproducible? So which is also based on the animal factors, because there are a lot of inherent variabilities in how animal
Right.
responds, how they are housed, what kind of nutrition they are given. So we need like ethical sciences also, like good science, where you have like more standardized systems in place. So that kind of thought process and sensitization also needs to be brought about to the larger community. It is definitely happening in the last few years, so that's what I would say. Yeah.
Okay. One final question. I know you mentioned this earlier, like back in April of this year, the US FDA had released a roadmap, right, to kind of
Right,
phase out
right,
animal studies.
right.
I presume theirs is the first one as compared to the Europe,
Yeah,
right?
so Europe is also having a lot of these initiatives. Like recently, they released the research area plan for the next few years, 2025 to 2027. And
Right.
amongst those three or four points, like accelerating the development of non animal methodologies is one of the major points
Okay.
for
Okay.
Europe also. So it's not just happening in isolation, it's happening, both in US, Europe, and even in India, actually. BIRAC,
Hmm.
DPT BIRAC recently held multi-stakeholder consultation meeting in May, where they got together different stakeholders like CDSCO, there is Bureau of Indian Standards, and multiple such stakeholders to see how we can develop regulations for complex in vitro models, which are basically a type of non-animal method. So even in
Hmm.
India, like the shift where the regulators are, cognizant that we need to have like, regulations and processes in place, even in India, to kind of incentivize the use of these systems. So yeah.
So do we have a roadmap now in India where all these stakeholders, like the government, industry,
Not yet.
academia,
So that meeting happened in May. So hopefully, something would come out of that. Hopefully, and we are also working with different government stakeholders to develop like a funding roadmap for these technologies, where we prioritize certain technologies, and we are working with academia, industry, and government to see how we can prioritize certain technology and develop like a strategic funding roadmap for the next 5 years. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Great. All right. Thanks, Surat. I think this is a wonderful conversation. But before we close, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think like again going back, like when I started working in this space in 2019, where when I
Mm.
used to speak to people, like nobody was really aware of this space. So I think a lot has happened in the last 5 or 6 years. So I think there is both global change and changes in India are happening, but we need to have like very some dedicated funding, investment, and strategic thought process, and how we can streamline this. And something also that would be very critical to this is developing dedicated, centers of excellence. So that's what has been
Yes.
done in US and Europe also, which
Right.
kind of, those centers of excellence have been set up in collaboration with pharma, hospitals, etc., to kind of develop end-to-end technologies with, which come out with high technology readiness level, technologies which could be readily adopted by pharma or academia or something. So those kind of COAs. And, like I said, establishing indigenous supply chain. So that would be critical if we need like more widespread adoption. And that kind of comes in line with this Make in India concept, right? Where that we need to
Right.
have our own homegrown technologies, not just technology, but the entire supply chain.
Right.
And some policy initiatives, like you said, policy incentives, like FDA said that they are not going to fund any like only animal based proposals. They're not going to fund, so it needs to have like a non-animal component. So that's a very clear message from the government and policy makers that they are willing to take that extra step to make that shift. So that kind of policy incentives would also be great to kind of take it to the next level.
Right. Wonderful. So a lot of things that we have, that in India can kind of be more progressive, as not just in the policies, but also in the implementation as well.
Right,
Thank you so
definitely.
much, Surat. Wonderful having this conversation with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was very nice talking with you and discussing about this space, Malati.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Surat. And thanks to all our listeners. We will just wanted to quickly remind that our 12-week graduate certificate in public policy course will be starting in September 6th. And the deadline for that would be the 24th of August. Right. Thank you all. Thanks for listening in. Bye-bye.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.